In a single overnight mission, American forces destroyed more than 60 Iranian attack boats spread across 80 separate locations along Iran's coastline. 60 boats. Not one raid on one base, 80 different points hit in a single coordinated wave, in a stretch of coastline that runs for hundreds of miles. If you've been following this war casually, catching a headline here and there between everything else competing for your attention, you almost certainly missed how big this specific operation actually was, because it happened in the middle of a week, so packed with strikes and counterstrikes that most coverage moved on within a day and never came back to it. It shouldn't have. This is one of the most significant single strikes of the entire war, and by the end of this breakdown, you'll understand exactly which coastal bases got hit, why Iran built its naval strategy around small boats hidden along hundreds of miles of coastline in the first place, and what losing 60 of them in one night actually does to a military that's been using those boats as its primary weapon against commercial shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. Before we get into it, a word on how this breakdown is built, because trust matters more than speed here. Everything in the next 20 minutes is drawn from official CENTCOM statements, direct reporting from CNN's live coverage on the ground, Al Jazeera's operational reporting, Naval Today's defense-focused breakdown of the strike itself, Military Times, and Dawn's coverage out of the region, cross-checked against each other rather than taken from a single source. Where Iranian officials and American officials disagree on numbers or intent, I'll tell you both sides and flag exactly where the disagreement is, instead of picking whichever number sounds more dramatic. That's the only reliable way a story moving this fast stays trustworthy, instead of becoming another feed of unverified claims dressed up as settled fact. Let's start with what actually triggered this specific strike, because it did not happen in isolation, and understanding the trigger is essential to judging whether the response that followed was proportionate. In the first week of July, Iran attacked 3 commercial vessels transiting the Strait of Hormuz, a Marshall Islands flagged tanker called the Al-Rekayat, a Saudi flagged tanker called the Wedian, and a Liberia flagged vessel called the Cyprus Prosperity. CENTCOM described those attacks as unwarranted aggression and a direct violation of the ceasefire that had been holding under a memorandum of understanding both governments signed on June 17th. In response, U.S. forces launched a large strike package that hit more than 80 locations across Iran's coast in a single coordinated night. And inside that operation, over 60 Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps small boats were destroyed in and around the strait, alongside air defense systems, command and control networks, coastal radar installations, and anti-ship missile capabilities. That combination, boats plus radar plus command networks plus missile sites, all struck within the same coordinated operation, tells you this wasn't a punitive strike aimed narrowly at making a political statement after one bad week. It was built, deliberately and systematically, to dismantle an entire operating system Iran had been using to threaten shipping, not just punish it for one attack. Now here's the part most coverage skipped past, and it's the part that actually explains why this strike mattered so much more than a single night's headline suggested. Those 60 boats weren't sitting in one big naval base where a single strike could take them all out. Iran's small boat fleet, mostly fast, low-cost speedboats operated day to day by Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps naval personnel stationed along the coast, is deliberately dispersed across dozens of small coves, fishing harbors, hidden inlets, and improvised coastal shelters strung out along hundreds of miles of Iran's southern coastline and its outlying islands. That dispersal is the entire point of the doctrine. If your navy can't match a conventional adversary ship for ship, you don't build a handful of large, easy-to-target warships. You build hundreds of small, cheap, fast boats, hide them in places of bigger power struggles to track continuously, and use them in swarms to threaten much larger, much more expensive vessels moving through a narrow choke point. It's the same asymmetric logic you'll recognize if you followed naval conflicts anywhere else in the world over the last 2 decades. Cheap and dispersed beats expensive and concentrated when you're the smaller power in the fight. Hitting 60 of those boats across 80 locations in a single night means American intelligence had mapped out a huge chunk of that dispersed network well in advance, not just found one lucky cluster of boats sitting in the open. That's why the phrase coastal hideouts actually fits here better than it might sound at first. These aren't traditional naval bases with piers and dry docks you'd see in satellite photos of a normal navy. A lot of these are small, low-profile positions specifically chosen to blend into fishing communities and civilian coastal traffic. Exactly the kind of dual-use ambiguity that makes this entire strategy so hard to counter and so legally complicated to strike. Taking out that many of them in one coordinated wave means the strike planners had to have identified specific, individual locations rather than one obvious target. And that level of precision against a genuinely dispersed, deliberately hidden fleet is the actual headline here, even though it never got framed that way in most of the coverage that week. Let's walk through the specific geography, because the locations that got hit across this stretch of the war tell their own story about Iranian naval strategy. Over a 5-hour mission around the same period, CENTCOM confirmed strikes on Bushehr, Chabahar, Jask, Konarak, Abu Musa, and Bandar Abbas, targeting coastal defense systems, missile and drone sites, and maritime capabilities. Each of those names matters individually. Bushehr sits on Iran's central Gulf coast and hosts both the country's main nuclear power complex and significant naval infrastructure side by side. Chabahar and Jask sit further east along the Gulf of Oman, giving Iran a coastal presence outside the strait itself, useful for extending small boat operations beyond the narrowest, most heavily monitored stretch of water. Konarak has hosted IRGC naval facilities for years now. And then there's Abu Musa, which is where this stops being a purely military story and becomes a story about contested sovereignty too, because Abu Musa, along with Greater Tunb and Lesser Tunb, are islands Iran has occupied and militarized for decades, but which the United Arab Emirates also claims as its own territory. Iranian state media reported last year that the IRGC was actively reinforcing its presence on all three islands, and CENTCOM later confirmed a 90-minute round of strikes specifically on Greater Tunb Island during the same stretch of the war, hitting military positions on disputed islands that a Gulf ally also claims sovereignty over adds a layer of regional political complexity that a strike on Iran's mainland coast simply doesn't carry, because it puts the United States in the middle of a decades-old territorial dispute between Iran and the UAE, whether that was an intended message or not. Let's also talk about Keshm Island, because it came up in reporting the same week, and it's another piece of what officials have called Iran's arch defense near the strait, a chain of islands and coastal positions specifically arranged to give Iran layered control over the narrowest, most strategically vital stretch of water in the entire Gulf. When you put Bushehr, Chabahar, Jask, Konarak, Abu Musa, Greater Tunb, and Keshm on a map together, you're not looking at scattered, disconnected targets. You're looking at a strike campaign that systematically worked through nearly every major node in Iran's coastal defense architecture within the space of about a week. That's the actual scale of what's been happening along Iran's coast this month, and the 60-boat strike specifically was the piece of that campaign aimed directly at the small, dispersed, asymmetric fleet Iran had been relying on to menace commercial shipping day to day. Let's go deeper on the Abu Musa and Tunba Islands situation for a minute, because it deserves more than a passing mention, given how much it complicates the diplomacy sitting underneath this entire strike campaign. These three islands, Abu Musa, Greater Tunb, and Lesser Tunb, sit right at the mouth of the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran has maintained military control over them since 1971, in the final days of British withdrawal from the Gulf. The United Arab Emirates has disputed that control ever since, and the disagreement has never been resolved through international arbitration or a negotiated settlement. It's simply persisted as one of the Gulf's longest-running unresolved territorial disputes, occasionally flaring into diplomatic tension between Abu Dhabi and Tehran, but never escalating into open conflict on its own. Iran's decision to reinforce its military presence on all three islands last year, reported by Iranian state media itself, was widely read by regional analysts as a signal that Tehran intended to use those positions as forward operating points precisely for the kind of small boat and coastal defense operations that ended up being targeted in this strike campaign. When American forces spent 90 minutes striking military positions, specifically on Greater Tunb, they weren't just hitting an Iranian military target, they were conducting a strike on land whose sovereignty a key American Gulf partner actively disputes, which means every one of those strikes carries a diplomatic weight beyond the immediate tactical objective. Whether that geopolitical dimension was the primary motivation, or simply an unavoidable consequence of hitting a real, active military position that happened to sit on contested ground. I also think it's worth explaining in a bit more technical detail what it actually takes to build the kind of targeting picture that let this strike hit 60 specific boats across 80 separate coastal locations in a single coordinated night, because that capability is arguably the most impressive and least discussed part of this entire story. Fixed infrastructure like a radar site or a missile storage facility can be identified once through satellite imagery and stays put for months or years, making it a relatively straightforward target to plan against over time. A dispersed fleet of small, fast, individually hidden boats is a completely different targeting problem because by the time a single satellite pass identifies where a boat is sitting, the boat could have moved somewhere else entirely before a strike package arrives hours or days later. Hitting that many of them simultaneously in positions specifically chosen by Iran to avoid exactly this kind of detection points toward a sustained, layered surveillance effort combining multiple intelligence sources, feeding a single, coordinated targeting picture in something close to real time. That kind of capability doesn't happen by accident in a single lucky pass. It reflects weeks or months of accumulated pattern of life tracking across Iran's entire southern coastline, correlating boat movements, likely hiding positions, and probable dispersal patterns until planners had enough confidence in enough individual locations to justify committing a strike package against all of them at once, rather than picking off a handful of the most obvious targets and leaving the rest for another night. That points to something else worth understanding about how this specific war has been fought differently from earlier conflicts in the same region. This isn't a war being fought primarily with large, dramatic single strikes against a handful of iconic targets, the way earlier Gulf conflicts sometimes got portrayed in media coverage. It's being fought as a sustained, methodical campaign against distributed networks, distributed air defenses, distributed coastal radar, and now distributed small boat positions hit through accumulated intelligence and repeated, coordinated strike packages over weeks, rather than a single dramatic opening night. The 60-boat strike is a useful lens for understanding the entire character of this war precisely because it shows that pattern in miniature, a target set that took real, sustained intelligence work to even locate, followed by a single night where a meaningful percentage of that dispersed network got hit all at once. One more piece of context that helps explain why this particular strike landed as hard as it did strategically, even setting aside the raw boat count. Small boat operations are inherently a numbers game for the side, using them asymmetrically. The entire doctrine depends on having enough dispersed capacity that losing individual boats to routine patrol interceptions or isolated strikes doesn't meaningfully change the overall threat picture. Losing 60 in a single coordinated night breaks that underlying math, at least temporarily, because it removes a large enough chunk of the total fleet all at once that the remaining undamaged boats can no longer credibly threaten the same breadth of coverage across the strait that the full dispersed network could manage before the strike. Whether that effect proves lasting comes back to the same open question I flagged earlier: how much reserve capacity and production capability Iran retains to rebuild what it lost, but the immediate tactical effect of concentrating that much damage into a single night, rather than spreading it out gradually the way earlier strikes in this war often did, is exactly why naval analysts and defense reporters treated this specific operation as more significant than a routine week of strikes, even in a war that had already produced months of near-constant military activity by the time it happened. Iran's health ministry reported that more than 260 people were injured in the recent strikes against Iran, including at least 3 women and 6 children, and Iran's government spokesperson said more than 30 civilians had been killed. I want to be precise about sourcing here the same way I have been throughout this breakdown. CNN reported these figures directly from Iranian officials and explicitly noted it could not independently verify them. That doesn't mean the numbers are wrong. Iranian government casualty figures throughout this war have often lined up reasonably well with what's gotten independently confirmed afterward. But it does mean you should hold them as reported claims from one side of an active war rather than settled fact. Exactly the same standard I'd apply to a casualty claim coming from the American side. What's not in dispute is that a strike campaign spanning dozens of coastal locations across a full week produced real civilian harm alongside the military targets it was aimed at. And any honest accounting of this operation has to hold both truths at once: that it was a genuinely significant military achievement against a real threat to global shipping, and that it happened in populated coastal regions where people who had nothing to do with Iran's naval strategy ended up paying a cost too. Let's get into the tactical logic a little deeper, because understanding why the specific target set mattered so much requires understanding what these small boats had actually been doing before this strike happened. Throughout this war, Iran's approach to threatening the Strait of Hormuz hasn't centered on its larger, more conventional navy. It's centered almost entirely on fast attack boats, mines, and shore-based anti-ship missiles working together. Those small boats can swarm a single commercial vessel from multiple directions at once. They're hard to track continuously because there are so many of them dispersed across so much coastline, and they're cheap enough that losing individual boats doesn't meaningfully dent Iran's capability the way losing a single large warship would. That's exactly why a strike specifically designed to take out 60 of them simultaneously, rather than picking off a handful here and there over weeks, represents a fundamentally different approach than what came before it. You're not attriting the fleet gradually. You're trying to collapse a meaningful percentage of the dispersed network all at once before it can regenerate or redistribute to new hiding positions. And that regeneration question is actually the honest, uncertain part of this story, the part where I won't pretend to know more than what's actually been reported. Losing 60 boats in one night is a real immediate blow to Iran's small boat capacity in and around the strait. What's genuinely unclear from public reporting is how much reserve capacity Iran has sitting elsewhere along its coastline, in additional hidden positions that weren't part of this specific strike package, and how quickly it can produce replacement vessels given the manufacturing base it's built for exactly this kind of low-cost, high-volume naval asset. Neither CENTCOM nor independent naval analysts have published a clear estimate of Iran's total remaining small boat inventory after this strike. And until someone credible does, the honest answer to how much this actually degraded Iran's long-term capability versus how much it was a serious but ultimately replaceable one-night loss is that we don't fully know yet. There's a useful historical comparison here too, because the United States and Iran have fought exactly this kind of asymmetric naval confrontation before, decades ago, in almost the same waters. Back in 1988, during the Iran-Iraq War, American forces fought a one-day naval engagement against Iran known as Operation Praying Mantis, launched after Iranian mines damaged a U.S. Navy vessel in the Gulf. That earlier fight also centered heavily on Iranian small boats and coastal missile positions, and it remains to this day the largest surface naval engagement the U.S. Navy has fought since World War II, a fact that tends to surprise people given how much larger and more famous other American naval operations from the decades since have become in the public imagination. The fact that nearly 40 years later, the exact same category of threat, dispersed small boats operating out of Iran's southern coastline, is once again the central tactical problem American commanders are trying to solve in these same waters tells you something important. This isn't a new Iranian strategy invented for this war. It's a doctrine Iran has refined and leaned on for decades, specifically because it's proven durable and hard to fully eliminate, even after a serious single-night defeat like this one. There's another side to this exchange worth understanding in detail, because Iran didn't absorb this strike passively. In the hours and days following the 60-boat operation and the broader wave of coastal strikes around it, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps responded by targeting American military infrastructure across the Gulf, hitting sites in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan with drones and missiles, and triggering air raid sirens as far away as Bahrain's capital, where the country's interior ministry issued a public shelter-in-place warning to residents. The IRGC was explicit about its intentions afterward, stating publicly that retaliatory operations would continue. That's worth sitting with, because it means the 60-boat strike, however significant on its own, didn't function as a knockout blow that ended the exchange. It functioned as one major escalation inside a rolling, continuous cycle of strikes and counterstrikes that was still very much active in the days that followed. Iran also separately claimed it had struck and disabled 2 commercial tankers it described as rogue supertankers, alleging the vessels had switched off their navigation systems and attempted to cross through what Iranian authorities called a mined route, a claim that adds yet another layer of contested narrative to an already complicated week, since it's Iran's characterization of the incident and hasn't been independently confirmed by outside shipping trackers in the same terms Tehran used. It's also worth understanding just how much strike volume this specific week represented in the context of the entire war so far. CENTCOM stated that across 3 consecutive nights around this same period, its forces struck more than 300 targets at the direction of the sitting commander-in-chief, all aimed at degrading Iran's ability to threaten commercial mariners and vessels transiting the strait. 300 targets in 3 nights, with the 60-boat operation representing just one strike package inside that broader campaign, gives you a sense of scale that a single headline about boats destroyed doesn't fully capture on its own. This wasn't an isolated punitive raid. It was one identifiable piece of a sustained multi-night campaign working through Iran's coastal military infrastructure at a pace and volume that's been unusual even by the standards this war had already set earlier in the year. I want to spend a moment on Iran's broader threat around regional energy exports too, because it ties directly back into why the small boat fleet specifically mattered enough to warrant this kind of concentrated strike. Alongside closing the strait to unauthorized shipping, Iran explicitly threatened to shut off additional regional energy exports as this exchange escalated, a threat that, if carried out at scale, would extend the economic disruption of this war well beyond Iran's own coastline and into the broader Gulf energy market that neighboring producers depend on just as heavily as Iran does. That threat is precisely the kind of leverage a dispersed small boat fleet is built to enforce. You don't need a large conventional navy to make a shipping lane dangerous enough that insurers and shipping companies start avoiding it voluntarily. You just need enough fast, hard-to-track boats capable of boarding, mining, or attacking vessels unpredictably that the economic risk calculation shifts on its own. Destroying 60 of those boats in one night isn't just a tactical naval achievement. It's a direct strike against the exact mechanism Iran has been using to make that broader economic threat credible in the first place. Because it's genuinely different from targeting a fixed facility like a radar station or an air defense battery. A boat is mobile by definition and can relocate within hours, which means intelligence identifying 60 separate boat locations across 80 sites has to be current, not weeks old, or the targets simply won't be there when the strike package arrives. That points to a level of real-time or near real-time surveillance across Iran's coastline that's worth appreciating on its own: satellite coverage, maritime patrol aircraft, signals intelligence, and likely input from the same kind of unmanned surveillance platforms that have been operating in this theater throughout the war, all working together to build a target picture accurate enough to hit 60 specific, individually hidden boats in one coordinated night, rather than a handful of obvious ones sitting in plain sight. I also want to address something that came up constantly in how this strike got covered and mischaracterized in some corners of social media in the days after it happened. The idea that destroying small boats represents some kind of overwhelming, one-sided massacre, rather than a legitimate military operation against an active combatant force, a framing that spread quickly online precisely because it's more emotionally simple than the messier reality of what actually happened. These weren't civilian fishing vessels caught in the wrong place. They were IRGC naval assets, operated by uniformed military personnel, that had been actively used throughout this war to threaten and, in some cases, directly attack commercial shipping, the same shipping. This entire strike campaign has been justified around protecting. CENTCOM's own stated objective for the operation was explicitly to reduce Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping and disrupt freedom of navigation through one of the world's most important trade routes, and striking the specific asset class Iran had been using to carry out exactly that kind of threat is about as directly tied to a stated military objective as a strike package gets. That doesn't mean every individual strike within this campaign is beyond scrutiny. Plenty of legitimate questions remain about proportionality and civilian harm in populated coastal areas, but conflating a strike on active military boats with an attack on civilians misunderstands what actually got hit that night. Let's zoom out for a second and talk about how this fits into the broader arc of the war, because this strike didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened during a specific documented breakdown of a ceasefire that had briefly given the region a real chance to de-escalate. The June 17th Memorandum of Understanding represented weeks of diplomatic work, and for a period it actually held. Shipping partially resumed, oil prices eased back from their wartime highs. The attacks on the Al-Raqayyat, the Wedian, and the Cyprus Prosperity in early July marked the specific, identifiable moment that ceasefire broke down, and CENTCOM was explicit in describing the 60-boat strike and everything around it as a direct response to that violation, not an unprovoked new offensive. Whether you view the underlying decision to reimpose a naval blockade and resume strikes as proportionate or excessive is a genuinely contested political question that reasonable people land on differently. But the sequence of events itself, ceasefire, attack on commercial vessels, immediate large-scale military response, is not seriously disputed by either side. The market reaction to this stretch of the war is worth understanding too, because it shows just how closely global energy markets track every single escalation in this specific waterway, often within hours rather than days. When the naval blockade was reimposed and this wave of strikes began, Brent crude, the primary global oil benchmark, surged more than 9.5% in a single trading day, settling above $83 a barrel, its biggest one-day percentage gain in more than 6 years, and its highest settle price since mid-June. The U.S. benchmark, West Texas Intermediate, moved almost as sharply, jumping more than 9% to its highest level since mid-June as well. And that's not a modest market adjustment you'd expect from routine wartime noise. That's the kind of single-day move typically reserved for a genuine, credible supply shock. And it tells you traders around the world treated this specific round of escalation, the ceasefire collapse and the strikes that followed it, including the small boat operation, as a serious threat to actual oil flow through the strait, not just another headline in a war that had already produced plenty of them by that point. So where does all of this leave us? A single coordinated strike destroyed more than 60 of Iran's small attack boats across 80 locations, spanning hundreds of miles of coastline, in direct response to attacks on 3 commercial vessels that broke a month-old ceasefire. It was paired with strikes on air defense systems, coastal radar, command networks, and anti-ship missile sites. And it happened alongside a broader week of strikes hitting nearly every major node in Iran's coastal defense architecture, from Bushehr to Chabahar to the contested islands of Abu Musa and Greater Tumb. It produced real, if disputed, civilian casualties alongside a genuine military setback for the specific asymmetric naval strategy Iran has relied on for decades in these waters. And it happened inside a war that's already shown, repeatedly, that ceasefires here are fragile. Oil markets are watching every single move, and the underlying dispute over who actually controls the Strait of Hormuz remains as unresolved after this strike as it was before it. Here's my honest read on where this fits into the bigger picture. Militarily, this was one of the more effective single operations of the entire war so far, precisely because it targeted the specific capability, dispersed, hard-to-track small boats, that had been doing most of the actual damage to commercial shipping up to this point, rather than symbolic targets that make for a dramatic headline without meaningfully changing Iran's ability to keep threatening the strait. Whether it produces a lasting shift depends entirely on something we don't have clear public information on yet: how much reserve capacity Iran still has scattered across its coastline in positions this strike didn't touch. and how quickly it can rebuild what it lost. If Iran's small boat fleet mostly regenerates within weeks, this becomes a serious but temporary setback in a war that keeps producing serious but temporary setbacks on both sides. If it genuinely degraded Iran's capacity in a way that holds, that's a more meaningful turning point. And the clearest evidence either way will be whether Iran's attacks on commercial shipping meaningfully slow down or keep happening at the same pace in the weeks following this strike. I'll be watching exactly that. Whether shipping attacks continue at the same tempo in the weeks ahead, or actually drop off in a way that's clearly attributable to this specific operation, because that's the real test of whether 60 boats in one night change anything that matters strategically, versus just producing one very good headline in a war that's already had plenty of those come and go without lasting consequence. Two things before you go, because on a story this detailed, they genuinely make a difference. If breakdowns like this, the kind that name every source, separate confirmed military statements from disputed casualty claims, and actually explain the strategy behind a strike instead of just reporting the boat count, are useful to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because this war keeps producing exactly this kind of underreported, high significance operation that gets buried under bigger, louder headlines within a day or two, and a subscription is genuinely the only reliable way to make sure you see the ones worth your time instead of whatever an algorithm decides to surface that week. And drop a comment telling me what you want tracked next, whether Iran's shipping attacks actually slow down in the weeks after this strike, what's really happening on those contested islands with the UAE watching closely from just across the water, or a deeper look at how Iran's small boat doctrine compares to what we've seen in other asymmetric naval conflicts around the world over the past few decades. Those comments genuinely shape what gets covered here next. And on a story evolving this fast, that kind of direct feedback matters more than it might seem from the outside. Thanks for watching, and stay with this one, because the real verdict on this strike, whether it held or whether Iran quietly rebuilt within weeks, is still a little while away from being clear.